to everybody who is has now joined, who's joining. Now, before we begin, I'd like to say that we are recording the session. We just started, so please, if you don't want to be filmed, do switch off your mic, do switch off your camera, and that's all. Then the other thing is these sessions come very much in the sequence of the seminars we did in the office at Eric Parry Architects for these last few years, and now we are doing it, of course, online, given the circumstances, and in collaboration with London Met. So the proceedings will be very simple. Eric will be chairing the session. And then that will be followed by Peter Carl's presentation, which should be around 36 minutes or so. And then there'll be questions from Nick eventually, if he wishes, and also Matthew, before Eric passes it on to the floor. I may have questions too. We'll take it as we wish and as the proceedings go. So that's all. And I think Matthew wanted to. He had a few notices. So please, Matthew, if you will.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to say also welcome to everyone from the point of view of London Met School of Art, Architecture and Design. As José said, we are co-convening this series and looking forward to making more of a project of it going forwards that we can do together. I wanted to give, I think most people here are aware that we've lined up several sessions going forwards. We have Carolyn Steele, who is here also on the screen. I can see Carolyn. She will be speaking on the 13th of January 2021. And then William Mann, who I think also just arrived, will be speaking on the 16th of February 2021. If you'd like to stay up to date, visit the Centre for Urban and Built Ecologies website on London Met, and we will keep updating the programme, and all recordings will be on our playlist on YouTube. So that's all I have to say, and now I'm going to hand over to Eric to introduce Peter and chair the session.
Thank you, Matthew, hugely. I, just by way of introduction, and Peter is known to I think everyone who's tuned in, obviously hugely well, but I want to simply say that I believe Peter's the most inspirational of his generation, and it's a position that he's achieved with great modesty, enthusiasm, and a delight. And that's particularly in the progress of his former students, amongst whom are really celebrated writers now, critics, teachers, and practitioners. I think without maneuvering through a lengthy list, it's just a good example to pick of their common gratitude. Fabio Barry's dedication in his recently published Painting in Stone, published by Yale, simply a single dedication, Peter Carr. And I know from Fabio, you know, that is the tip of a very deep iceberg of emails, of thousands of emails running back decades, in support and in pursuit of the imaginative in creativity and architecture, and you know, I think that's so lacking generally in our life. So here we go. Really, thank you on behalf of all those present for offering us, Peter, the Enigma of Embodiment.
Thanks very much, Eric. That's overly generous. And wait a minute. Okay, there we go. Hopefully this will work. Sorry, all you folks are going away. Okay, can you see that?
Not yet.
You should have it.
Peter, if you unshare your screen and share again.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's try again. Okay.
Okay.
Now we
Yes. And now if you go to full screen.
There, we're there. Can you hear me?
Yes, fine.
Okay, thanks very, very much. It's very generous introduction, much too generous, more than I deserve. This, I'm afraid, won't be as coherent as David's wonderful, wonderful presentation last week. It's sort of a trip to the Horniman Museum with a mixture of things that I've been looking at recently with stuff you've heard 100 times. As I say, it's my test run was about 36 minutes. Okay. Embodiment seems to be a Western preoccupation arising in its current form in the German Romantic turn away from philosophical systems to poesy and nature. As a response to or a reaction against idealism, it acquired a greater generality than, for example, evidence in law or the relation of substance to mathematics in experimental science. The is God a mathematical problem? Precisely because of the importance of poetics, it was of course indebted to much older traditions associated with Aristotle, such as Hyle Morphe, or matter form, and Physis Nomos, or nature and culture, or custom, and particularly to Christian incarnational symbolism, resulting during Romanticism in notions like the ensouled earth. Also, it would be a pleasure to work with these earlier traditions. I wish to begin with a more recent example of embodiment poetics, the Holber Museum project of Eric in 2011, with all apologies for stealing images from his website and for any misinterpretation. As I understand it, the project started by intervening in a version of that quintessential Georgian artifact, the country house, here constructed of Bath limestone, a material described by a local historian as both golden and sacred. The house lies, can you see my arrow?
I can't, no.
Okay, well, we'll skip that then. The house lies at the end of Baldwin's Great Pulteney Street, which arranges the inhabitants in face-to-face symmetry like one of the dances performed in the assembly rooms. Behind the house lay what was originally known as Bath Vauxhall Gardens, where Georgians could enjoy dining, concerts, and performances. These gardens combined two innovations of the period, the English garden and the Industrial Revolution, the latter in the form of a railway cutting and a parallel canal. They're together redolent of the conflict which afflicted England ever afterwards between, quote, England's green and pleasant land and its dark satanic mills, quote, in the words of William Blake. To the greenery and the iron needs to be added a third material central to the Holborn collection, but also to the culture generally, and not only in Bath, ceramics. As a vehicle of the imagination, ceramics range from stalwart containers for grain to exquisitely refined but often sentimental and kitsch table pieces and vases. Although the visual qualities of ceramics strike the viewer of a gallery, the proper handling of delicate cups and vessels was important to Georgian decorum. The handmade tiles of the facade reenact the trees of the garden. They also recall the trees and vines that so often appear in the domestic ceramics, and as a rain screen, they preserve the involvement of the domestic ceramics with liquids, though in the building turned inside out. The engineering of this facade also transforms the inevitably neatly arranged domestic ceramics in their table settings into an argument that fuses the dreamy artificial naturalism of the English garden with the precise management of forces of the Industrial Revolution. At a time when Vienna was making the transition from Mozart and Haydn to Beethoven and Schubert, and France was working its way towards the Revolution and Napoleon, the ambiguous, somewhat ephemeral culture of Georgian Bath is difficult to grasp. There was at stake no deity or other iconographic focus. There was rather a vague festival time out of time that placed Jane Austen's decorum of social exchange between art and dissolution, as you see in the Rowlandsons, at least for those who could afford to participate. And of course, they're supported by a small army of servants, cooks, musicians, and so forth. Bath was less an ideal city than an enchanted urban theater disposed about the green hillsides with a Roman spa at its heart. Enhanced by the rehabilitation of the 18th century rooms, touring the collection in the museum invokes the contemplative side of this enchantment, familiar from the more didactic versions of English Garden, and the viewer is caught up in a double historicism, the present memory of the classical revival. My interpretation is quite inadequate by comparison to those of David Leatherbarrow, but it has repeatedly found itself operated between the extremes of dreamlike ambiguity and rigorous precision. Perhaps this is characteristic of architecture generally. Anyway, by declining to add yet more Bath stone to the house, the existing stone and its architecture are no longer a relentless background, but are elevated to a role in the referential framework. As it happens, when the building was considered for conversion into a hotel in the late 19th century, a winter garden was proposed for this site. In any case, by working the material thematics or embodying conditions of the existing stone, the greenery, the iron steel, the ceramics, and the topography into a rhythmic box that exposes the collection to the movement of daylight and reinstates dining open to the garden, a quite rich architectural metaphor is created. The term metaphor is appropriate because the materials are not assembled as pure abstract pattern, but understood in terms of their respective referential contexts. The emancipation of artistic interpretation from what I have called a focused iconography, Dalibor is described as, quote, the task is not only to invent a particular building from one's own cultural resources, but also to invent a culture which would make the building meaningful, end of quote. Hegel termed this phenomenon of emancipation the end of art and attributed it to the Lutheran Reformation. On the left is the high altar of Vicenza, 1534-6, taken from Fabio Barri's extraordinary treatment of the metaphoricity of marble from the ancient world to the Enlightenment, which may be regarded as a compendium of artistic thinking prior to Reformation debates, to which the researches of José, Christian, Nick, and Patrick can be related. On the right is the palace chapel at Hartenfels, Torgau, of a decade later than the Vicenza high altar. It is the so-called first purpose-built Lutheran church, over whose dedication Luther himself presided, preaching from the balcony on the right. The two high altars express the stark difference. Almost all of the rich mediation of the Catholic Church has been expunged. I say almost because Luther would not go as far as the Calvinists. He still required a modicum of embodiment to secure the ritual efficacy of the community of believers, all of whom are, of course, priests, gathered around the altar and its cross, here positioned before a column representing faith, which supports the organ pipes for communal hymns. This configuration reappeared in the 18th century Lutheran Frauenkirche at Dresden, meticulously reconstructed after the war, which may indicate an abiding need among certain Lutherans to approach their God with more than individual faith. Lutheran iconoclasm is often depicted in negative terms, whereby, for example, Dürer, Wittstoss, Tilman Riemenschneider are seen to mark the end of a traditional representation in Northern Europe, and Holbein goes to England. And with that, we arrive to art as it is presently practiced, as a vague theater of meaning, with the museum as secularized church and the artist as secularized divinity. Jacques Maritain, in his acerbic fashion, traced the path of reform based on individualism from Luther to Descartes to Rousseau, and therefore to the French Revolution, although we might place the origin of this motif actually in Renaissance perspectivism, and perhaps even in the nascent humanism of the 14th century, which can be detected from Chernin to Cordoba. The philosophical and literary god of the Romantic philosophers and poets was essentially Lutheran, and the secular sacred, so-called Kunstreligion, was fortified by God substitutes like the philosophical absolute and the aesthetic sublime, as well as by the holistic aspirations of Schelling's Naturphilosophy, which stimulated the pantheism of the mid-20th century and has recently been resurrected by John Tresh, Ian Hamilton Grant, and Tim Morton. None of the Romantics had to contend with that son of the Lutheran pastor, Nietzsche, nor could they benefit from the insights of the Lutheran Kierkegaard, who is important to Charles Taylor's understanding of contemporary secularism. By placing so much emphasis on personal belief and upon the community of fellow believers, Luther's church laid the ground for the public sphere as a contested milieu of individual moral judgments, which Habermas sought to resolve through appeal to rational discourse. Under these conditions, the nature of belief itself became obscure, at any rate since the 17th century, caught up in the contest with empirical science. The positive reading of this state of affairs is that it may display an honesty to the human condition. Accordingly, as Dilthey first recognized, contemporary hermeneutics grew from the Lutheran Romantic hermeneutics, and Gadamer opens the second part of Truth and Method by quoting Luther's version of the hermeneutic circle, in turn derived from Augustine's rendering of Isaiah 7:9, "Unless you believe, you will not understand." Nonetheless, good Catholics like Dalibor, José, and Patrick are able to deploy phenomenological hermeneutics in order to understand pre-Reformation examples, because hermeneutics does not tell you what to believe, only to take seriously the contexts, including your own. The Lutheran Hegel placed architecture at the bottom of a hierarchy that proceeded upwards through sculpture, painting, music, and ultimately poetry, in an ascent to what he deemed the highest level of self-consciousness. Hegel intuits here a stratification of dependency that is more precise than the maxim regarding architecture as the mother of the arts. However, against Hegel's emphasis upon the Geist, or the contemporary emphasis upon mind, or cognition, or intelligence, artificial or natural, we might agree with Dalibor again that, quote, architecture represents the most elementary mode of embodiment that enables the more articulated levels of culture, including numbers and ideas, to be situated in reality as a whole, end of quote. Iconoclasm generally attacks the embodying phenomena in the name of spiritual purification, though often, as in both Byzantium and Protestantism, it is mixed up in questions of power. Conversely, one cannot subtract the religious component from the purism of Le Corbusier and Ozenfant, in the light of what Colin Rowe called the, quote, gospel of the early modern manifestos. The moral force of these programs of intramundane redemption lay in the promise of decent dwelling for everyone, therefore incorporation of the middle class, which, as Ed West reminds us, is a phenomenon of the Industrial Revolution. Accordingly, the proselytes of this new dispensation adopted a modesty or austerity, inspired by anything from Cistercian churches, the apse in Lou Kahn's drawing, to 17th century court ceremony to the Shakers. We no longer derived our architecture down from temples, but built it up from houses. The programs were pervaded by a quasi-technological instrumental mysticism, exposed in the problem of Liszewski's Russia Architecture for a World Revolution, of how to reconcile the social engineering with the meaning, the poetics, which would obtain in the infinitely referential world of space and form. This strategy placed inordinate emphasis upon the optical performance of the architecture and its possible communication with the more ample thematic resources of drawings and paintings, particularly when the architecture was mostly disseminated in photographs and hyperrealistic renders. If we might detect an abject relic of Beaux-Arts composition in Eisenman's struggles with form, always more interesting in model than in actuality, can we say, in Dalibor's terms, that an appropriately rich culture and building are imagined in the more analogic universe of Le Corbusier? Here only a small fragment, to save time, appropriately with the shadow of the photographer. There are two tables, one in shadow, one in sunlight. One the agon of a game, the other the agon of conversation. These are echoed in the platforms after which the villa was named, les terrasses, which float in a great void in the house, making a theater of openings, colored walls, and shadows, a kind of virtual building. The floor of the balcony is partially glass block, and the back wall is the one to which you arrive from the front of the house and ascend to the piano nobile. The whole operation is summarized in the little niche. Taking the villa as a fragment of the blocs aridents of his cities, one is apparently promised emancipation into what he later called l'espace indicible. This all may just be a question of good, bad, or better architecture, but I suspect our architecture has become a symptom of a more profound question. Above and beyond recalling the optical performance of architecture that mostly prevails in peripheral vision, I would like to clarify the problem of imagism and embodiment by approaching it from a slightly different direction. You're undoubtedly familiar with this type of image, alternately funny and disgusting. It was plucked from an attendant neural net, trained to correlate certain images with their verbal descriptors in order to try to understand how it worked. Embedded in it are multiple heads, centipedes with rodent heads, crystal whale for sweets, even doubled, even an arcade, or two versions of the same arcade over on the left. In fact, it's not really an image. We just expect it to be one. It is the result of a process of pixel differentiation according to statistical weightings. The computer is obliged to fill the whole surface area like any screen. The instruments are trained to look for edges and transitions, and so are helpless in a smooth field, desperately making guesses it creates edges that don't exist. Inspired by the neural configurations of actual brains, the question of the relation of such procedures to actual vision perception remains controversial, particularly in the role of pattern matching and the analogy of calculation, according to which all qualitative phenomena, like metaphor, arise from complex logical procedures. For humans, at least, the reverse seems to be the case. The approximate analogies of metaphor precede and underlie the capacity for precise logical thinking. These systems are obviously useful for specific tasks, but until something more fundamental than algorithmic functions can be implemented, Google's premier AI research unit, DeepMind, should probably be renamed FlatMind. What is most missing is the content. If you showed the apparatus an actual stoat, it wouldn't know what to do with it. Its world is entirely populated by digitized photos. That is, what is missing is the perception of what, on which Husserl based experience and intentionality. It is estimated that as of 2010, the individual human brain has roughly as many nodes as the whole World Wide Web. And this tiny fly brain, notice it's only 3 millimeters long, the whole fly, and what you're looking at is, you're kind of looking at its head upwards. So that's all that stuff that you see on the right is the left optical lobe. The brain is in the middle, and there should be another right optical node. This gives a sense of what goes into an entity who, as far as we know, does not write poetry, though it might hum a tune to itself with its wings, and needs only to find food and mates and to avoid predators, dangers, and obstacles. However, the quantity of nodes and their modes of communication in a brain is only a small part of the phenomenon. Such a brain is not installed wetware, preloaded with desires and fears assigned to the requisite stimuli. It has evolved through interactions with its world. What accounts for intelligence here is not restricted to the fly's brain. Via the six-legged, winged, goggle-eyed body of the fly, intelligence is distributed among the food, the mates, the predators, the dangers, and the obstacles, along with things like air currents. Whatever intelligence is attributed to the fly cannot be separated from its involvements. The same is even more true for humans, endowed with a much broader spectrum of possibilities. I believe the term involvements better characterizes the phenomenon than intelligence, which privileges the mental life, which we deem so special about being human. Since the late 1980s, a large body of research has developed the insights of figures like Merleau-Ponty and Jacob von Uschkel, who inspired Husserl's Lebenswelt, as well as J.J. Gibson, Lakoff and Johnson, Pickering, and many others, in order to explore this phenomenon of distributed, metaphoric, processual structures of involvement. Somewhat counterintuitively, this body of research identifies itself under the rubric of cognition, but is usefully collected in the Oxford Handbook of 4E Cognition, where 4E stands for embodied, enacted, embedded, and extended. All this is very stimulating, but the single most important omission, in my view, is the absence of any mention of depth or the structures of dependency which obtain in any involvement. I'm using this Caravaggio to illustrate that thoughts move faster than and depend upon conversation, which in turn depends upon posture and gesture, which in turn depends upon the furniture, which depends upon the floors and walls. The wall here is a deep background in which, just before vanishing, Christ appears in the shadow of the servant, also making evident the manner in which the light brings into being the people, food, and things, including the passing of the light through the wine vessel just above the bread, fusing the incarnation with the passion. I prefer structures of involvement over intelligence, cognition, or ecology, because the stress is placed on the situations in which any exchange or interaction takes place. Worldhood of world exists as a generalization only in the background, as a mood or tone. For all effective purposes, worldhood occurs as concrete involvements. An involvement prevails in a tension between what Gibson called affordances and what Heidegger called claims. What I have called structures, too, are dependent upon the interactions and are much less rigid than is suggested by the frequent appeal in the literature to systems. They are open to opportunities and adaptations. Precisely what cannot be rendered algorithmically, the embodying conditions, is what is most essential to any plausible understanding of intelligence, continuity, or communication. I would not deny the degree to which humans experience the tension between affordances and claims psychologically, sociopolitically, or philosophically, i.e. our mental life. But the virtue of attention to involvements is that our mental life is not made central or determinative. Rather, it is set within a rich matrix of possibilities for embodiment, rooted in the natural order. If one extends Carolyn Steele's wonderful analysis of the cultural metabolism of food deep into the natural order, it becomes evident, for example, that human language depends upon a profound sedimentation of pre-linguistic ordering processes, including our fly. For what it's worth, this recovers the position of the ancient cosmologies, whereby human affairs were secondary to the given natural order. In this example for the Christian Middle Ages, Honorius of Autun has attempted to schematize the Neoplatonist John Scotus Erigana's Periphysion on nature. So this has a genealogy which stretches back via Pseudo-Dionysius and Augustine to Plotinus, and ultimately to Plato, where it is no longer an ism. The created world in the middle, time, matter, and place, give the four elements, is an emanation of the principles personified at the top, and so endowed with ethical purpose, in this case represented by Christ. The light in the Caravaggio says much the same thing. Just as a note, the three at the top, the three figures, essence, life, and wisdom, were for Erigana embodiments of the Trinity, and wisdom, with he correlated Christ. Her cloak joins those of virtue and justice on the opposite side. This notion of the world we inhabit being always already intelligent is not so naive as it may look in Honorius's diagram. It is precisely what is disclosed in the distributed, metaphoric, processual structures of involvement. The natural order is now, of course, significantly compromised by technological intervention. However, even technology needs to obey the so-called laws of nature, and so the basic understanding seems plausible. AI is more interesting for the questions it raises than for what it is at present. Donna Haraway's 35-year-old Cyborg Manifesto still stands as a credible approximation of the cultural implications of adaptation to a world where the integrity of embodied narratives, on the column on the left, dissolves into a system of embodied information, the column on the right. Although Haraway looks forward to the passing of, quote, white capitalist patriarchy and to a scrambling of gender identities and roles, there's little in principle in her conception to prevent the sort of world conjured in the much-hyped video game Cyberpunk 2077, which seems to have implemented both sides of Haraway's lists, or both of Haraway's lists. All the embodying condition in the game, all the embodying conditions are attenuated through digital cyborg manipulations, and everything can be hacked, physically or digitally. The new dispensation seems to have confused the game's reviewers. What usually constitutes a main plot is in fact a thin MacGuffin, and the usual hero saving the world finds themselves wandering instead through endless side quests where the game actually takes place. Similarly, the reviewers complain that the conflict of factions and all the opportunities for transforming identities are superficial. They seem to have no point. That surely is the point. When all the difference has equal value, nothing matters. There is a reason AI researchers regularly call for ethical understanding of their discipline. Ethics is extrinsic to the operation of the machines. An intelligent and talented student of Matthews, now teaching at Cooper, Mokena Mokeka, that's him in the upper right, recently gave a talk on future cities in which he showed this image. He was discussing the advent of megacities in the context of climate change and mass migrations, and he suggested these cities would look less like the image on the left and more like the collage on the right. Minus the flying cars, we should probably imagine both, with great inequalities, much as Luanda is today, as Paula Moreira has demonstrated. Wondering about the metabolism behind these two images, we have on the left architecture schools, professional institutions, developers and property investment, insurance, global supply chains, contractors, all refracted through CADware and the WWW. On the right, which seems to have extended Torre Davide in Caracas to an urban scale, we have cell phones and sometimes global supply chains, but it's hard to imagine architecture school sorts of discussions with drawings and models presented to reviewers uttering comments like, maybe your window should be a different proportion, or maybe the nails in your timber should be a different pattern. Rather, the recycling is done with midnight material supply and hand tools, more or less collaboratively, and generally outside the legal framework to which the builders remain vulnerable. With respect to Dalibor's problem of an architecture that might create its own culture, this choice was not in the open speculations of the early modern manifestos, even if there persisted from the 19th century regular trolls through what urban sophisticates called the vernacular, or the primitive. Books such as those by Ehrenberg, Douaneau-Sendreur, or Luc Sont endowed their topographies and people, despite all the conflict and suffering they depicted, with a moral integrity aimed at the middle-class purchasers of the books, for whom these milieux were exotic. The combination of guilt and genuine concern induces a tact when architecture schools are moved to take seriously amelioration of informal settlements. Intelligent interventions avoid grand colonialist gestures. Rather, the strategy is to work practically with the concrete conditions, often showing a greater respect for those conditions than the inhabitants, who probably dream of 2 BMWs in a pool. The Diwat's installation of Maurice and Beau in Kachpura on the left, and on the right, Matthew's skywalk for the Philippe Station Space Project in Cape Town, began not with drawings, but with conversations and negotiations with the inhabitants and the relevant civic bodies. The interventions eventually acquire the quality of urban surgery, making their context come alive, shifting the register to a basic dignity, as Matthew titled his dissertation, From Township to Town. The station links the township to central Cape Town, while the skywalk, furnished with market kiosks, links 2 public squares north and south of the track. At Kachpura, the attention was devoted to the wholly inadequate toilet and sewerage of the town and to remediating the polluted Nala with a reed bed, which as a consequence created a place where weddings could be held, which is what's going on the right of that image. If informal settlements exhibit the distributed, metaphoric, processual structures of involvement in a very visceral, almost intimate way, interventions such as those of Matthew, Maurice, and Beau avoid the imputation of middle-class sanctimony or do-goodism, a frequent colonialist trope, by recognizing that architecture can only establish the embodying conditions for self-empowerment, which is the principal objective. They also set a standard for the decorum for the much discussed sustainable city. If by contrast we look at another version of Mokena's proposition, the transformations in New York City across a century, we see a movement from a milieu at the bottom, from a milieu of concrete engagements and dramatic infrastructure to, in the middle, the last mention of the creator god in Rockefeller Center in the 30s, to what, at the top, the developer claims is a 21st century version of Rockefeller Center, Hudson Yards. From a distance, this slice of Neo-Dubai indulges a familiar cluster of translucent phalloid, which houses offices, luxury apartments, restaurants, and a complete selection of all the high-end shops you'd find in duty-free. The renders feature 20 to 40-year-olds with branded shopping bags. The amenity on which the developer most frequently insists is that of great views, as if Hudson Yards were the center of New York and everything else was a spectacle of little people. However, I was surprised to learn that this 350-ton balcony on the far right and at the top of the image in the center, on the 100th floor, and its attendant champagne bar and restaurant were expected to pay for the whole building. From this, I conclude A, that nobody ever went broke underestimating the taste of the American people, and B, that we are in the presence of a sublime monument to disembodiment. The project advertising regularly uses the term world class. To me, world class is the Great Mosque at Cordoba, but in any case, New York will always be all these layers. I would like to finish with a remark on the ghost in this show, the question of ethics. I am inclined to leave ethics to the fundamental natural conditions, traditionally interpreted theologically or philosophically, as we saw in Honorius, but presently suspended between the extremes of an indifferent universe of material processes and a living entity suffused with divine order. Moral judgments, on the other hand, emerge in the particular historical situations of praxis, for which there are only implicit rules. One must be practiced, as Gadamer regularly declares. This means they are the province of the much vaunted human freedom, which, however, is as likely to indulge partial understanding, error, evil, and selfishness as it is profound understanding, truth, goodness, and generosity. As Max Scheler put it, quote, "We are the species who knows it does not understand," end quote. It is anyway certainly naive and possibly worrying that the people in architects' renders are infallibly well behaved. Still for me, the most accurate rendering of the city's capacity to harbor the full range of its citizens' good and bad behavior is the Dublin of Joyce's Ulysses. Dear dirty Dublin, with in 1904 the highest death rate in Europe and an average of 9 people to a room, embodies European urban culture in all its layers. This image is a small portion of a large drawing by Freddie Phillipson, which he uses to understand the role of architecture in the novel, part of his extraordinary lecture on the topic, to which I commend you. Joyce followed Aristotle, for whom our only access to the universal is through the particular. Joyce's resolutely concrete, even visceral prose subtly absorbs actual people and settings into a fictional world. And, again after Aristotle, poetry is more true than history. Indeed, the embedding of works in poetic rhythm or set to music is itself a phenomenon of embodiment. But here I defer to the poet, Pele. Joyce's renowned stream of consciousness is a stream of experience or involvements, some promising, others banal, some frightening or disgusting, but each comes freighted with portents that range from an individual satisfied tummy to European traditions in ancient Greece or European religions, or in Shakespeare or Bach. Joyce does not indulge surrealism, but he does indulge what Benjamin, in his article on surrealism, called profane illumination, and Joyce called an epiphany, according to which the deeply plausible harbors the remarkable, little insights into life. Peripheral vision may itself be a term too oriented to the optical, since the periphery or background is, by definition, out of focus, a mélange of mutually interacting potential involvements. And of course, one is oneself, part of everyone else's background. Joyce's novel is an affair of the background, the world of Dublin's lower middle class, avoiding the city's major institutions. What is remembered of the stream arises from the involvement with what? The content, the judgments of praxis, always poised between commitment and refusal. Indeed, the background streams, and doublet is the reciprocal complement of the Liffey. For any individual, it is a matter of navigating the affordances and claims of Dublin's institutional orders, which distribute the potential for involvements according to the situational typicalities. A city, as the embodiment of its institutional orders, captures everything from local taste, prejudices, and accents to economics. And a gang or violence have their institutional characters, even if less deeply sedimented in the civic order than those institutions which attract special clothes and architecture. This is the matrix for the topographies of agonic depth, explored by Patrick, Jane Classic, and Justin, as well as for the ceremonial life developed by Chris Frost. Indeed, Joyce's novel is a version of Time Out of Time. Embodiment is always collective, resonating in the institutional memory. At the same time, the memory depends upon the embodiment. This helps to account for how the distributed, metaphoric, processual structures of involvement might evolve the moral practices whose obligation to this deep context in turn gives rise to the experiences of transcendence. Great, thanks very much. I will dump my screen here and rejoin the chat. Sorry, everybody's.
No, absolutely. Over to I mean, you know, that an affair of the background. Wonderful, wonderful phrases. So many. Let's turn to the questions, and Matthew, perhaps first, right?
I think we'll start with Nick, if Nick is ready. I think Nick is primed.
Where do I start? What a extremely interesting and thought-provoking lecture, Peter. I think one of the things that I find you're obviously articulating something which is at one level very familiar to all of us about our contemporary culture in the context of this deep understanding of history, and the whole kind of question of embodiment versus disembodiment. And I think the notion of structures of involvement, of course, becomes absolutely key to that. One of the things I've always wanted to talk to you about and ask you in the context of the nature, the content of this material, is when you explore the problem of pairing of opposites, of dualities, and particularly in the context of culture and nature. I'm interested in how you see this question of embodiment tackling this issue in the context of contemporary issues of nature, in view of the fact that what we're facing in terms of our current crises across the globe. But how would you address this in the specific context of the natural order, or how it's actually presented philosophically in very different ways?
Yes, the question of actual is an interesting one. I mean, this is a relevant. You ask a question that I think about a lot. People like Philippe Descola have challenged the authority of notions like nature and culture by placing that in the context of things like totemism and animism. I'm not going to go into that any further. What bothers me about that is that it is like another effort to turn these alternative ways of being with contexts into structuralist concepts, and doesn't give them their due. To me, the dualities aren't irrelevant, and you certainly have to take them seriously as you trawl your way through something like Western philosophy. But what I'm calling the structure of involvements does, and in particularly the notion of the distributed metaphorical processual modes of involvement, is that it kind of smears those distinctions. They're all, as I say, any embodied, there's no such thing as a hunk of matter that attracts an iconography, except possibly in an art historical caption. These meanings, the associations, and the way one's involved with them are always, as I say, collective, embedded in the institutional memory. You simply don't have an embodiment by itself. Even, the chemical description of marble is surrounded by a cultural apparatus. Wilderness is a concept invented by city dwellers. One is always involved with nature, even operating a computer. And if the dialectic is useful, fine, if it helps, but I think it's always the two together. And what's more important is not the schematism of nature culture, but the depth of involvements and potential involvements in which we situate our moral judgments, and which give those moral judgments a sense that there is a judgment to be made about being committed or turning it down, of being involved or being apathetic. And the primary involvement itself is one of attunement. And one can only do so much. I probably should be not wasting your time and out planting trees. But insofar as architecture and the way it qualifies our backgrounds is a help to understanding how our overly vaunted, words. I mean, Cambridge still is the trivium and the quadrivium. They have no idea what to do with architecture, like most universities. And insofar as architecture helps us understand, architecture in cities helps us understand with what we're involved, I think it illuminates the difficulty. I mean, the tendency for somebody like David Watkin marries notions like the styles with morality and goes around naming good and bad architecture. It fails to catch the drama that's really at issue. And as I say, the degree to which our architecture is itself a symptom of the difficulty of our relations to the fundamental conditions of which you speak. Well, that's what I'd say now. Ask me again tomorrow.
Just to move that forward, unless you've got more, Nick, it seems to me that there's a vast gap between the informal, and the disembodied image of Hudson's Yard, and somewhere in the middle there must be some sanity. I don't know, Matthew, you're leading off next.
Yeah, I guess coming at it from a different dimension, different direction. But this discussing this, let's say, functionality, if you like, of architecture with regard to the task of understanding. One of the aspects of your presentation that that resonated for me with the specifically architectural dimension of its philosophical aspects is about treating embodiment for the designer or the artist or critic as a verb, as a kind of practice in the form of intellectual and practical making, if embodiment is, if you like, treated as a verb. And you, at the beginning, when you were talking about the museum, you used the words argument and interpretation. So what you talked about was the strength of argument as a fusion, right at the start of your talk. And you talked about this fusion with regard to the ceramic and the tree and the act of making by hand. So I just wanted to come back to this idea, especially around the idea of a structure of involvements, the idea of embodiment as, if you like, a verb with regard to the dynamics of argument and interpretation, and at the same time, the making inherent in architecture, in design.
Yeah, no, again, a very appropriate question. Certainly one of the, some of my, some of the things I'm saying, you can find in Martin Pauly in the early 70s. It's not entirely a new argument. Insofar as there is something different happening, it probably displaces, it probably gets in the way of notions of just architecture. I take my hat off to any architect who is talented. There's a gift there that I just have to respect. And they do what takes me a million words to talk about through a kind of judgment. And it gets called talent or gift. And sometimes, it depends on the circumstances. I don't know if Eric had been asked to house some ceramics in a cafe on the back of Sainsbury's, I could have been able to tell the same rich story. So a lot of what he has done is mobilized what already exists into a condition which is at play when you're part of the building. And again, my words, you can't, I wouldn't carry them around as a caption to the building. or like one of the, descriptions underneath an exquisite vase from the 18th century. The stuff is more visceral and more vague, as experienced. Your kids are hungry. I don't know if I can deal with yet one more vase. The view through that slot is just extraordinary. Where's the daylight coming from? Do they prune these trees? There's so many other things going on and coming in and out of focus. Quite what's at stake in design, because it's now passing through CADware, it's particularly asking to be, it's very difficult to sketch in CADware, though of course in certain programs it's possible, because it demands that you say, well, exactly how long is that line? Why are you shading that line? If you do shade a line, it's a program that tells you you can do that, and it means nothing to the program. It just is a graphic ability. Whereas if you're doing it as a sketch, a shaded line carries all sorts of possibilities. And the dialogue between what's at stake in design, what's at stake in experiencing the building, is as it is, for characters in Ulysses. Sometimes an explicit issue, sometimes all you care about is, a cup of coffee. And so the degree to which it goes in and out of focus is inevitably part of the malleability and adaptability of the structures of involvement, but also their capacity to hold on, and if one's interested, to actually ask questions of real depth. And as I say, there are architects who can do this without any of my words or the words like mine. They do it through their architectural judgment in a way that I'll never be, or never was even, a ballerina or, even a hockey player. There is a way of orienting oneself in reality through these complex processes of commitment and refusal that enable people to make architectural judgments, and that's why we hire architects. They can do things like that, as well as, carry on negotiations with people who didn't care that an architect ever turned up in the first place, and why are you here sort of problem. And so as I said, some architects are absolutely at home in CADware. Other architects are much happier, drawing with ink on blotting paper. Danny Liebigson draws with coffee on tissue paper. There's just many ways of skinning a cat. I don't think what I'm much less, it's like practice generally. You have to be practiced, and you practice in order to be better practiced. I'm very much against this is a way to do it. I think one can only celebrate, ways in which it's happened well, and kind of store those in a way that, I don't know, Picasso looked at Velázquez. He doesn't produce it under Velázquez. He produces Picasso, but you can see the Velázquez in it. I don't know if that's an adequate response.
Thank you, Peter. Thank you, Matthew. I think David Leatherbarrow is asking to come in, which would be wonderful. David?
Thank you, Eric, and thank you, Peter. I have some hesitation because I think Peter knows I was raised a Lutheran, and I might be
part of the conspiracy.
Part of the conspiracy. Discussing Eric's building, Peter, you, if I'm not mistaken, used the term frameworks of reference. References were key. One of the dimensions of that beautiful description that I wanted to recall toward the end of the talk, through much of it actually, but especially in the account of Joyce in Dublin, instead of reference, they were structures of involvement. I wonder about the relationship between the two in your thinking, or perhaps even those two works by Parry and Joyce. One thought I had is that there is inevitably a dimension of articulation in every embodiment, or that there is no articulation without some concrete embodiment, and the reciprocities between the two are variable. And is that what I detected as the similarity and difference between the built and written works in your account? Mainly mine was an issue of vocabulary. I took care and have always been admired by the usage and its refinements. So I thought there must be something in this interpretation of the richness of that building that allows one to describe it as a framework of references that it makes apparent in its physical body and visual sense. But perhaps if you could just say a little bit more about the interconnections between these structures or frameworks of reference and of involvement.
Yeah, absolutely spot on. And yes, yes, yes. I completely agree that embodiment articulation, like physis nomos, you never get earth world. You never get one without the other. As I say, wilderness is a concept of urban sophisticates. And work of reference was a way to just get into it because I wanted to have enough material to begin working with it later on. That framework of reference at the end was characterized as cultural institutions, or another term for it is institutional horizons, i.e. all embodiments are always collective, resonate in those horizons in which I would think. And it's in terms of those that I could, I don't know, say, drop Eric's building into Ulysses in place of, say, the library, where Stephen Dedalus is debating about Shakespeare and so forth. Though I probably wouldn't use it for the printing press. That is to say, there's terms like decorum talk about that background mood that in, as I suggested in the novel, part of the streaming, which allows for and promotes specific moments of attention or involvement or commitment or refusal. Possibly another way that we tend to look at it from the point of view of things that add up. When I say that we are always part of everyone else's background, it's useful to think of this in terms or from the point of view of being simply part of somebody else's background. It's in that way of looking that these kind of deeper structures and their eddies and tidal movements become more evident, and one feels more, in Heidegger's words, claimed by them. So I would completely agree with you in what you point out, but it seems to me possible for Eric's building to be as much a product of Joyce's prose as Joyce's prose might be involved with Eric's building, because of the horizons of communication, the decorum, the particular moments of attention and inattention that such settings promote and discourage. And I don't know if that helps. I think there's a much longer, much more detailed philosophical discussion that I'm that I really, that's the kind of thing that I'm reluctant to talk about, and I really have to do word by word in print. And at some point, I hope to be able to do that. It's part of what I've been working on. And I've left out a whole bunch of stuff on how, for example, Chinese architecture has something that looks like geometry, but they didn't get Euclid till the 16th century. So where's it coming from? Or both Islam and Christianity had Al-Hazm at the same time, and yet developed quite different interpretations of the optical interpretation of infinity in parallel. And to a certain extent, I mean, in the latter case, well, it doesn't matter. When you get into situations like that, the words help because they slow down the thinking. You can't just sort of be a Han Chinese standing off in the background of court ceremony or something like that. You can't do a Schleiermarker. The reconstruction is part of engaging with what's in play and trying to be attentive to what's in play without turning it into the opposite description of the totality, the thermodynamics of embodied information, by which you end up with a completely flat universe. Again, I don't know if that helps.
It does, and I'll just end with an observation, Peter, that your presentation helped me see that if indeed architecture helps us understand with what we're involved, that understanding occurs differences, involvements, and
involvements come without references.
Exactly that.
Yeah, yeah.
So there, if you will, there might be modalities of understanding and the interplay of references and embodiment structure, or elaborate that field of different modes of understanding.
Yeah, I'd probably make understanding an aspect of involvement.
Yeah.
When I talk about the gifted architect, I don't think that, you can see all the gears in Schinkel. He's clearly thinking through everything explicitly, and it gets laid out, he's definitely got a talent and so forth. Whereas, and to a certain extent, you can see that in Le Corbusier's early buildings. But I was just involved with a really interesting dissertation on Aalto's Imatra, where, much to my surprise, there's a very close engagement with important Lutheran theologians. But quite what Aalto made of it is still a mysterious and fascinating thing. I mean, I'm not going to either repeat the dissertation or go through my reading of it. But there is a kind of what the architect contributes that in the end you can only do through the architecture. I don't know if you call that an understanding. It's certainly a more profound orientation than a lot of theoretical understanding exhibits or philosophical understanding. There is a kind of tenor or decorum or mood that is directed, and you may reject it and say, no, sorry, I need much more, I need something more like Rochon, it needs to be chthonic, it needs to be violent, it needs to be many more materials and so forth. Well, fair enough, good, that's part of how you need to be with the world. I mean, what's this business of getting rid of temples and building ourselves up from houses has made things like the deep questions most invisible. And the kind of thing you're asking really points to the deep questions. And I think architecture used to be, the Great Mosque at Cordoba, it used to be able to set the stage for the deep questions. Now world class is a 350-ton balcony, 100 stories in the air. Forget it. And I think the question that Nick asks is the right one, that what does matter? And how do you know, is architecture, a lot of people say architecture is just about celebration. And after that, it's basically keeping us dry and housing the poor. But it's an index to how deeply we do take our world seriously in existence.
Yeah, well, that I just, in order that there are a few other voices, I think Maurice raised his hand first, and then I think Patrick Lynch has done so as well. So would Maurice like to start?
Yeah. Sure. Can you hear me?
Yep. I can't see you, but I can hear you.
No, I can see your nice drawing of Dublin. Thank you very much for the talk. It was wonderful to be open to such a breadth of conversation, which I've missed greatly since you left us. And I'd like to bring in a few of the words you gave to us a couple of years ago that I've been musing ever since. And I'd also like to refer to David Leatherbarrow's talk, which he gave a week or so ago. I asked him, because I was so obsessed with scale and trying to teach my students to be fluent with scale and to focus in and out and of course depth. So we've got depth, focus, scale, and dynamic movement, and you're wanting involvement and engagement and embodiment. So you try to focus in, but then you have the problem. And you're constantly being advised to scale up by all the funders, and the more you scale up, the less you're embodied, or unless you have an ability at a very large scale to be embodied in a way that most architects aren't. It seems to be a constant problem. And if you don't scale up, if you don't spread out, you're not aware. And David answered it by saying, we only have responsibility for what we choose to do in focus, but you have to be aware of the other things in order that you can that you can have embodiment. And I hope I haven't misremembered what you said, David, but it's still a problem for me because I feel fluency of scale in my students is really important to get them to understand and to get depth. But the further away you get, the bigger up, the higher the horizon, the more difficult it is to be embodied. And I wonder if you could just give us some guidance on those thoughts about how one can be both embodied and have a breadth of view as well as a depth of view, and where the responsibility is. Thank you.
Interesting question. I've always wondered about the term scale. It implies a general metric against which, for example, I had a Chinese student who showed me, who had on his laptop a group of projects that he'd been involved with in China, one of which was a marriage chapel, which took the form of the United States Capitol building, reduced in size by a factor of about 6. And posed in front of it was a horse and carriage with a happy couple in it. Clearly scaling down the United States Capitol. One would like to do it to the White House, at least till January 20th. Indicates how empty scale is of content to anyone who isn't practiced in it, who knows when the chapel should be the size of San Carlino and when it should be the size of St. Peter's, who knows that a petrol station needs to be able to accommodate large lorries as well as electric cars and motorcycles. So in lieu of scale, I talk about size and relate it to what's actually going on. If I'm doing a big box and it's filled with nothing but product, as they call it, then volume is all I need to talk about until I get to the tectonics of the skin, or the paths for robots. If, on the other hand, and one of the problems of skyscrapers is the inevitable, dullness of their repetition, their lack of a vertical order. It's great for the office because it pays for the office. You just say repeat 100 times. And of course, it's good for the engineers. At the bottom, the attention tends to be at the very bottom where it gets involved with the life of the city. And that can indulge, or that can invoke a tremendous amount of effort and work. And often at the top, though not always, in very different ways. I mean, there's probably a small typological study to be done of the tops of high rises. I'm not going to do it. So the business of scale to me, when somebody says this term scale up indicates that what I have already can be enlarged. If what I have already is a kindergarten and I want to make a school from K to 12, I automatically put in play the other classrooms, the other teachers, the sports fields, and worry about how the kindergartners will be part of and separate from those other people, even before we get into COVID. I'm into something like a small town. And so it's interesting that you pick scale, and the work I know you for is so very concrete and so very well judged. It's like an incredibly curious question coming from you and coming from your way of working, because it seems to touch on something that is a kind of metric waiting to be fulfilled with all of its life, rather than a judgment regarding, okay, I've got a school here that's pretty close to a house or something like that. Okay, I've got a whole, K-12 to 12 operation that's more like a little town, that involves politics, that involves, people who get distressed, people who need attention, so on and so forth.
Peter, I wonder whether that's the same debate between Protestant and Catholic, whether I was brought up a Protestant as well, and we try to get rid of all the decoration and superfluity in order to get to the essence and try and focus down. When we find there, we sort of worship caution and white walls and so forth, and because we don't feel we can handle the complexity and and we feel that it's out of date or irrelevant or something, and maybe that's. And so anyway, back to bottom down and top up, it's to me, the agon is where the two meet at the moment. In the projects we're looking at, it's where the top down forces or pressures meet the bottom up embodiment that we're so familiar with. I mean, working from the bottom up, that's what we would like, that's what we enjoy, and when we meet the top down, then that's the agon. And so I'm wondering if there's some parallel somewhere between Protestant and Catholic. I don't know.
I think that's a massive chapter you're opening, Maurice. So let's take that one offline.
Yes. Okay. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
No, that's great. I think we were. I can see Carolyn. Is Patrick there first? Carolyn Steele has also requested. So whichever. Let's go.
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Hi, Peter. Thank you.
Hi, Patrick.
How you doing?
You're on screen as your wife.
Yeah, I know that. I didn't make the same mistake twice.
No, thanks, mate. Yeah, alter ego. Yeah.
This is Cyberpunk 2077. I get it.
I must admit, I do find all this talk about Catholics and Protestants a bit boring.
Boring.
I think Danable would probably think that we're all basically kind of dealing with the problems of modernity, aren't we? And questions of embodiment and representation are they're kind of the Reformation is a function of modernity, of self. And and a shift from a priestly class to participation. But I'm still, like Dalibor, pretty much convinced that there is a relationship between representation, ways of working, and the embodied experience of crafting architecture and one's experience of it. And I know you were more Catholic in your view about the ways to virtue. But it does seem to me that the problem with the Hudson Yards work is that the disembodied character of the spatial experience, the perspectival, omnipotent, cantilevered space, it is the result of a certain kind of perspectivism that's inherent within computer CGIs. And lurking within Romanticism, which you know is the Nazarenes, the original Romantics in German were called Romantic because of their conversion to Rome, their addiction to handwork in the face of industrialization was a kind of, I don't think it was so much theological in terms of scripture as an attitude towards humanism, humanity, and the relationship of the mind to the body and the human being to the natural world in general. And within Truth and Method, Gadamer kind of starts an argument which ends up dealing with Kunstlehre, hermeneutics, and practical social wisdom and praxis by referencing Hegel's insistence on the importance of practical Bildung in German education. And in particular, he carries out a kind of trajectory from handwork or craft or skill towards commitment, a civic commitment, via travel, the education of a craftsperson being sent away from the place where they dwelled in order to earn a living in another town for at least 2 years. And Gadamer elaborates from this an idea of otherness, that the commitment to the profession means that you realize that there is something which you exclude other things. And this otherness is ultimately an encounter with yourself. And through this otherness of selfhood and estrangement, an understanding of creativity itself as the mediation or articulation of other people's desires. And I know I don't know if it's, probably sounds Luddite, I do think a reason why Eric's building is both powerfully embodied and crafted, and also has an imaginative ambivalence in that it's worked both by hand. The drawings are they have light and shadow on them. They have not just the reference to the trees, but the temporal dimension of the spatial experience of the sunlight through the trees, and the overall kind of dimension of fully embodied spatial experience as a communicative aspect. So I'm just slightly, there's this idea that it doesn't matter how you work. I'm not quite sure that's true, and I think that the problem of arts is perhaps directly related to the modes of architectural production. But I mean, you're more familiar with this in America. I think what Freddie's drawing depicts, and something that we tried to hold on to at the CAS, was the kind of primacy of this as a pencil, as a kind of way to unite eye and mind and hand and body. Isn't that really the kind of a dimension of embodiment in architecture that's...
Yes, certainly. I mean, that's the, yeah, I mean, you raise a number of interesting questions to start with, and I'll probably forget. I mean, we can go into Lutheran Catholics another time, but I think I'm interested in all forms of iconoclasm because they run counter to, you know, all the craft world and commitment to which you're committed. I mean, Tilman Riemenschneider, for example, is the absolute exemplar of the kind of hand body culture making of which you're speaking. And of course, once you say that no longer matters for religious reasons, and there is certainly a long tradition of interest in the crafts from the Romantics through to today as a kind of standard, first of all, as something connected to the embodying conditions, and second of all, as a kind of standard against which to measure stuff that probably doesn't look all that crafted. I mean, Le Corbusier, over and over again, insists that his buildings embody, you know, the Breton farmhouse or Alger or something like that. And I have nothing against the craft world, and I think the degree to which it's seen as autonomous, separated from, you know, a kind of architecture that can be made with Rhino AutoCAD, is, yes, to a certain extent, a cultural phenomenon. It's all those bodies that I mentioned that lay behind the metabolism of Mokena's photograph on the left. You know, it's the number of people that collaborate and latch on to what seem to you, or me at least, like completely trivial ideas of why to care. And just because what they just don't want to admit that what they're there for is profit, basically. And, you know, that perhaps one can also say that the Art Deco skyscrapers felt some obligation that, you know, from, you know, people like Alberti to, in quotes, beautify the city, to qualify the civic life of the city. These people seem to think they are the city, and that that what everybody wants is this kind of dream world, that, you know, they want to live in duty free for the rest of their lives. And preferably at the 100th floor. And that is a theological problem. That's why the connectivity between asking questions theologically and asking questions, you know, philosophically, I mean, the dialogue between poetry and philosophy goes back to the origins, as does the dialogue. I mean, an immense amount of Roman Catholic theology is indebted to Greek philosophy, as well as Orthodox theology, for that matter. You're dealing with primary questions that come up in different ways. And I think some people know how to get around CADware better than others. They know how to keep oriented, if only by letting other people do it while they keep track of what's, you know, really happening. You know, you're legally obliged to supply certain files in digital form, you know, or for BIM or for insurance or something like that. So you can't do without it. It may be that with climate, ecological collapse, farms will die and we'll be back to pencils, and only the people who didn't grow up on digital platforms will have any hope. But I think that the general import of your question, in terms of the question that Dalibor raised, of the building that needs to kind of invent its own context in order to be believed either by the inhabitants or by the architect, that you are looking at a symptom of something that does cross fields, that's, you know, for which there's university departments riven by, you know, debates between liberals and, you know, free speech speakers and so on and so forth. You know, it's not like you can take Gadamer as the Bible and just say, I'm not going to lose my head. Although I certainly esteem him very highly, I have 2 printed versions and 1 version from Scribd that I work with. But you know, the business of how you articulate yourself in your culture. I mean, part of the reason I'm interested in all the hype surrounding AI is when you get close to the AI researches, it all becomes much more sane. I wouldn't say it's brilliant. I mean, the recent book on metaphor by Hofstadter is supremely disappointing. It doesn't get past Lakoff and Johnson, but it's much more sane than the hype. And, you know, at the same time, somebody like Demis Hassabis, who's obviously very bright at this stuff and has endless energy. I mean, one of the comments he made after Deep Blue beat Garry Kasparov was, yeah, that's all fine, but Garry Kasparov is going to go home and cook a dinner. The computer can't do that. I mean, he's aware that, I mean, he calls it deep, I mean, in his initial research, because he was involved with games, was how much your episodic memory needed place in order to happen. So he's obviously a long way from that, but it's the kind of thing that he keeps aboard and that interests me, because I say AI is more interesting for me to what it tells me about architecture. I mean, I'm never going to become competent in it, and I'm not about to sit down and learn tensor programming in order to be able to operate a neural net. But insofar as it's part of the culture, insofar as it's part of the forces that, you know, I can't simply have cafe and croissant on a marble wrought iron table with a marble top, you know, in the Parisian rain. I'm on Teams.
Thank you.
I think there's a difference between Lutheranism and Calvinism that you touched on, which when one talks about Protestantism, I mean, Luther never called himself a Protestant. He was a Reformed Catholic, and the emphasis upon usus and actio, on the reenactment, the theatrical dimension of the Mass, and also the physical utilitarian aspect of the table, I think it is a kind of origins of stuff that you see through Christian socialism of people like William Morris and the Art Workers Guild, etc. And I think I do still. I mean, I'm not saying that obviously Gadamer's not. You know, it's not. I mean, he's a Lutheran, obviously. It's not. But I don't think he's trying to write a new religion. I just think there is in the questions of social reason that I kind of he's making a connection between embodiment and experience and practical wisdom, and I think that yes, that's theological, but it's also practical and a form of social engagement, and I suspect that the ultimate, as you used to say, you know, the kind of what people want is freedom from. I mean, what we haven't really kind of got our head around is freedom for what. That seems to be the example of Hudson Yards. It's just as if one is, yeah, kind of omnipotent and disengaged to the extent that one has to ask the question: is it architecture anymore?
Yeah. No, I mean, I completely agree. I mean, one of the reasons I've been working in medieval China and medieval Central Asia is precisely because of my, up to this point, over-reliance on the Western Christian tradition. And I think almost any question you touch on these days has some sort of religious background, or if you want to get rid of the religion, you get rid of all the gods, touches on the kinds of things that begin to clarify what we're part of and, you know, why we accept the world as whole, and what we might commit ourselves. And when I say that Chinese ritual architecture seems never to have worried about seeing itself as part of a geometric armature, it does it out of the rituals and out of the crafts, in a word. And that way of situating oneself, and, you know, you then have to put in the rest of what David and I were calling cultural horizons to understand it. And ultimately I don't, because I'll never speak Chinese, but it does give me a way to better understand my own circumstances. So what you say about, you know, the road between Luther and Morris, I'm extending to Le Corbusier, I'm extending to that vague notion of secular sacred, which is almost, you know, that you first see in Romanticism and that almost everybody employs when they, you know, they use the word sacred, like the person describing the Bath stone as sacred. What they really mean is important. They don't mean they've got a stone cult or they're sacrificing their puppy on blocks of, you know, Bath limestone. They're not even eating a meal off Bath limestone, probably.
Thank you, Patrick. Carolyn, would this, as everyone's got a kind of limit to dealing with this virtual, IT, Carolyn, could you ask your question, and maybe it's a very nice, elegant bridge to your own presentation in January.
You're on mute.
Carolyn, no?
Sorry, I'm not a great aficionado of Teams, and the pictures keep going around in a weird way. No,
brilliant
actually,
to see you.
It's lovely to see you too. And Peter, I love your lighting. No, I was actually thinking myself exactly the same thing, because I'm going to be, I mean, I think it's wonderful that Peter has mentioned food about 5 times in the last 5 minutes. And my question does relate to food. But I'm very, very happy to leave it to January. Explicitly, it was about your comment, Peter, about attention and inattention, which I found extremely interesting, because to me, that comes to the heart of the problem we're dealing with. I mean, it's something many years ago I called the mundane order of the city, which was the fact that all the really important stuff is the stuff that people day to day don't tend to pay attention to, because it's too embedded, it's too much part of their everyday world. And I think that's really what we've lost sight of. And I mean, my question was going to be quite long and rambling, not quite as bad as Patrick's, but getting there, because I kind of, I realized I can't multitask and I couldn't formulate it properly while I was listening to other people talk. But it is very much to do with the importance of the things that are so fundamental that we don't pay attention to them, and that really being a kind of a fundamental building block of the embodied. But I can happily come back to that, as I say, in January, and hopefully you'll be there and we can do it then.
My quick response is the Max Scheler, we're the species who knows it doesn't understand.
And indeed, that's the first thing that I wrote down that you said. Yeah, exactly, exactly. To be continued. I mean,
okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
So if I may, I think that we should draw this wonderful conversation to a close with regret. And but thank you, Peter. I think that single line of dedication lives on brilliantly and will echo on. So many thanks for this evening. Just fantastic contribution. All the best.
Thank you all.
May everyone stay well.
To babble. It's very kind of you.
Thank you, Peter.
Take care, Peter.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you very, very much. Enjoyed it. Brilliant. Thank you.
Ciao. Thank you.
Take care.
Stay healthy.
Peter. Thanks, Eric. Thanks, José. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Brilliant.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you all.